We did it on purpose just to harass the chair. No meeting goes unpunished, right? But that's the policy at Cincinnati. All right, well, thank you for coming. My name is Ben Kelcey. This is joint work with Feng-Shing Bai and Mona Antonika. Feng-Shing is also over here with me today. He's graduating this year, so he's on the job. I think you guys have any. And in actuality, this is his work. And so we flipped a coin, and he presented this work a couple of weeks ago, and so he's graciously allowing me to present this work today. But it's really his work and joint work between us, and so I'll lean on him for some of the details and some of the questions as well. So I'll get started and introduce both what is structural after measurement, and then what is N-level SEMs or structural equation models, and why does it matter whether you have small or moderate sample sizes? It just worked a minute ago now. All right, so some motivation and background as to why we're conducting this study with a ridiculously long title. It's not just to harass the chair. There actually is a reason why. Or we at least like to think there's a reason why. So the motivation is how can we consistently estimate parameters in complex but authentic N-level SEMs with small to moderate sample sizes? So let me unpack that just a little bit, that statement and our goal. And by consistent, the first part of that sentence, how can we consistently estimate? I mean unbiased, or at least unbiased asymptotically as things get larger and larger. So we want to have unbiased estimates of those parameters, those regression coefficients, structural coefficients, or the measurement model coefficients, parameters, in complex but authentic N-level structural equation models. So I think most people are probably familiar with what a structural equation model is, but what is the N-level layer of this? The N-level really means any level of nesting or multi-level or clustered structure, and that includes cross-classified structures. It also includes a more complex example of that, and we'll call those heterogeneous nesting structures, and I'll get into what those are in a couple slides. But we're really talking about any structural model that has many levels of nesting and very complex sources of nesting or disparate or heterogeneous nesting. And then last, the small and moderate samples. So this is a really important feature. Most of these structural equation models are estimated with maximum likelihood or with Bayesian methods. They're really data intensive. If you have a kind of a complex structural equation model, for example, a multi-level structural equation model or cross-classified, it requires just rounds and rounds of data. And so when we're talking about what are small to moderate sample sizes, it's very much relative to the complexity of your model. So if you're running a very simple SEM, there's some rules of thumb. Maybe you need a couple hundred or 100 or 200 people. Once you move to a multi-level structure, it gets to be much more challenging, because when we say 100 or 200 or more, we're not talking about the number of individuals, we're talking about the number of clusters. And in many cases, the clusters might be something like students nested within schools. Getting 200 schools is actually a really large challenge. It's actually really uncommon, at least in intentional or experimental research in education. So I'll argue that extant modes of analysis, the methods that we have, the software that we have, cannot handle this inherent complexity. They cannot handle the inherent complexity of our substantive theories. I'm going to talk a lot about education, but this is not unique to education. In social work or in psychology and many other social science fields, we have very sophisticated theories that we've developed. However, our models are really not able to bear out that theory or to fully assess that theory, because the data that we have usually doesn't align, the amount of data that we have usually doesn't align with the complexity of our model. And you can say, well, we increasingly get more and more computational power in different models. The issue that happens is all this machine learning, all these things that we do, we just develop more and more complex theories and models. So our theories keep pace with what we're able to do. And so in a lot of situations, we always find ourselves in a situation where we have too little data and too complex of a model, no matter what method that you're using. And so this is one attempt to address some of these issues. So more from a substantive motivation, I'm going to try to paint a picture or have a grounded example for us to actually illustrate some of these concepts and these issues. So I'm going to talk about the complex process of teaching. How do we develop effective teachers? What does effective teaching look like? What are some key teacher development processes that we might talk about, and how these map onto the complex structural equation model that we're going to talk about? So I'll talk about research on teaching, and research on teaching focuses on 4 prominent features. One is that we usually have very sophisticated theories that draw on latent variables. And so if you're familiar with teacher education or teacher training, there's usually 3 core constructs that we're really focused on. One is teacher knowledge, 2 is instructional quality, and then 3 is how that translates into student achievement. So one of the developmental processes that we're often interested in, or this path model that we're interested in, is how can professional development programs or training programs, pre-service programs, how can they affect a teacher in a way that improves his or her knowledge, that ultimately changes the quality of his or her instruction, and eventually impacts student learning or improves student learning. And so we have this kind of theory of action where we see, training or professional development leads to hopefully better knowledge in that classroom, which ultimately leads to better instruction when they enter their practice, either in their classroom or the pre-service classroom, and then eventually how does that change student achievement or student goals or student outcomes that we're interested in. Well, that's the first feature, is these sophisticated theories. And they draw on latent variables. So teacher knowledge is a latent variable. We can't directly measure someone's teacher knowledge, so we usually do it with something like a computer adaptive test or a paper and pencil test, where they're given a number of questions. This is pedagogical content knowledge. In other words, situated content knowledge within a teaching framework, or what you would do, what is the issue that this child is having, for example, when they're struggling to spell a word, or when they're trying to figure out an addition problem. Another latent variable is instructional quality, extremely difficult to measure. Usually we have people go in the classroom, trained observers, and they will rate teacher instruction using a number of different protocols, but there's a tremendous amount of error in there. So we can't directly measure the quality of a teacher's instruction. We have to indirectly measure it, and we use these latent variable models to try and get the best guesstimate as to what their level of teaching is. And then similar arguments apply for student achievement. You can't directly measure that. It's a latent variable. You use something like a test of achievement or whatever other outcomes you're interested in. That's just the first feature. The second feature is heterogeneous nesting structures. And these are a little bit more complex. So if you haven't heard of these, I'll try to unpack this both verbally here, and then we'll have a couple of diagrams in a minute. What do I mean by heterogeneous nesting structures? I think many people are familiar with nesting structures, and this is something like students nested within classrooms. That's a very simple nesting structure. And that one's going to persist in this example. We will take students nested within teachers. You can also consider them to be nested within schools, you're probably familiar with, and also cross-classified by neighborhoods. Not everyone that goes to a particular school comes from the exact same neighborhood. This is really true when you get to high school. You start to, particularly in urban environments, you have magnet schools, or people have student schools of choice, and so you'll have people kind of splintering off from their elementary school or their junior high or middle school into different programs that specialize in different concentrations of disciplines. So that's a very simple version of the nesting. That's what you've heard before. The other version comes in is, what if that nesting is not consistent instruments in our study? And the one that I'm going to introduce today is the measurement of teaching. Well, it turns out, how do we measure teaching? Well, we want the persistent quality of a teacher's teaching across multiple lessons or across the entire year. It's not just a snapshot on a single day. We want to know, were they a pretty good teacher across the entire year? And so what we do is we have multiple observations or multiple lessons. We have a trained observer go in a couple times in the fall, a couple times in the winter, a couple times in the spring. And so the nesting structure there is lessons or observations nested within a teacher. We have multiple, it's kind of like a repeated sample. We have multiple measurements nested within each teacher. And those measurements are also cross-classified by raters, because raters, we know, also introduce a number, they contribute largely to construct relevant variation. In other words, not every rater agrees on the quality of a particular lesson. So there's some variation that's unique to the rater that has nothing to do with the teacher. So we have this really complex nesting structure just for the measurement of teaching. It's observations or lessons nested within teachers, but then also cross-classified among raters. And so you see the measurement of teaching, the nesting structure for teaching